Welcome to the Northland Bass Podcast with fishing guide John Myrie and bass tournament angler Ken Melander. On the Northland Bass Podcast, we cover everything bass fishing for both largemouth and smallmouth here in the Wisconsin Northland and all across the northern tier of Midwest states. Hello, folks. I'm John Myrie, and sitting here today with me is co-host Ken Melander. And Ken, another Northland Bass Podcast.
Yeah, we have a lot of great bass angling up around the Hayward area, and it's pretty diverse, from pretty clear water to stained water. And, it's one of the most overlooked species we have up here, and you can have some really good fun catching and releasing them.
Yeah, you bet, and that's, we talk about the Hayward area here in northern Wisconsin. We're based out of there, basically, but that holds true whether you're in the UP of Michigan, you're all across northern Wisconsin, the east side, west side, or northern Minnesota, or even into the Dakotas now. The bass fishing is probably one of the best things out there, actually.
Yeah, they have some really good smallmouth lakes over there, too, and even some area in Montana has some good largemouth and smallmouth, like Lakuta Lane, along the Idaho border, and that, is really good for both species, too.
It seems to me that I read someplace a while back that north-south zone right across where we're at, where the areas we mentioned, was the prime, actually, habitat, temperature-wise and condition-wise, for growing big smallmouth. And that may be shifting a little bit to the north now, because I don't remember seeing some of the bigger smallmouth farther north that we're seeing now, but we're still in that zone where you can grow the biggest smallmouth, I think.
Well, Rainy Lake has always had, 5.5, 6 pounders, and there might even be some bigger ones in there, but they've been doing the Rainy Lake Open for, I don't know, at least 15, 20 years, and when they time it right, there's some big ones being caught.
Yeah, we talked about smallmouth in the last podcast, and we're going to be talking about it a little bit on this podcast, but the one thing I want to focus on here is the largemouth bass fishing again. That's really the overlooked thing, because you look at the weigh-in tournaments, these club tournaments and small tournaments, pretty much they're weighing in the same poundage of fish for the most part that the smaller tournaments weigh in farther south. So, the average size of the tournament seems to be similar in smaller tournaments, but the upper level fish aren't there like down farther south, I think.
Yeah, it's a growing season. That ice, when the water temp, stays at that low 40 degrees, they just don't feed as much. But on the other hand, I know of, I personally caught a 6.12 smallie here in 2007, I caught an 8.13 largemouth on a small lake that spring fed in October when the big ones moved up. And then not too long ago, I think it was last year or the year before, Wayne Basalvich caught like a 6.12 largemouth on Middle Clare. So there's big ones to be had.
You bet. They're big largemouth. And that, in the summertime, that's one of the things that a lot of people that come up here in north, whether it's here or Minnesota, wherever, can go on vacation. You get the walleyes. It tends to be a low light bite, evening bite, sometimes even after dark. But the thing about largemouth, you can catch them all day long, and that's a plus for people on vacation and people that just want to go out and catch fish.
Well, largemouth are driven by the distance of the bait getting to their mouth. So if it's high barometer, their strike zone would only be like 12, 14 inches, but you can still catch them. If the barometer is bad on a smallmouth, you can throw everything in them. They're just not going to bite you. So largemouth are always accessible to different presentations for every environmental conditions. You're just figuring out the best depth and the best bait and, what the cloud cover is doing, because cumulus or omnibus clouds makes a difference, where you go on a given body of water, the barometric pressure, the moon phase. They're not as affected as, some of the other species.
And that strike window thing you talked about, that's something that they used to talk about a lot. I don't hear it talked about so much anymore, but the distance that the bait is from the fish is basically, and it all depends on their activity level. So that's where your different presentations come in, whether you're trying to buzz a spinnerbait or a buzzbait over the top of them versus dropping something down in front of their face. And that's where you have to learn to be able to be versatile to change baits if you're not seeing action. If you can switch to a bait that's got more, I call it more vertical to it than horizontal sometimes.
Yeah, you are correct. So one of my books, I don't remember who wrote it, but I have a pretty good library at home. They say that largemouth can bite a lure for 12 different reasons. And one of them is a reaction. So regardless of what the weather conditions are, reaction baits, something coming by them, being an opportunist predator, they'll bite you.
Yeah, well, just about all fish, predator fish, have a reaction bite, and I've actually witnessed this with different fish, even muskies, where guys throwing baits. I mean, I had some guys years ago talk of muskie here, but we spotted this 40+ inch muskie laying up on top of some shallow rocks, and they're like, "Oh, we're going to catch that!" And I thought, well, he's up there digesting something he ate or something, and they cast at it, and fish never responded, and the guy flung one cast back over my shoulder, and it landed behind the fish, and it came down the side of the fish, and I literally watched the fish open its mouth, flare his gills, and snap at the bait. He didn't connect, but he snapped at it. So oh, yeah, you can actually, if it hits from the right angle and the right direction and kind of surprises them, I think it's kind of like I kind of compare it to you're sitting out in the yard and you get a great big old horsefly flying around 10 feet away from you and you're watching him. You don't bother him, but if he starts flying around in your fish, you take a swipe at him. And I think the fish do the same thing sometimes.
Yeah, I classify that as a territorial bite, similar to what they do in the beds, So if you invade their territory, there's been times, that I was fishing a tournament up in Grand Rapids, and I was up the river, and there was isolated patches of weeds off the big rice beds, on semi-current areas. And I figured out, well, if I invaded that little patch of weeds, I'd have to cast 1.5 ounce power bait worms up on the upcurrent side. And I'd have to dangle that thing a few times and let it hit the bottom. So the silt would come up there and get in his eyes and obscure his little scenic
vision area,
yeah, to bite something coming by on the 1.5 to 2 mile per hour current. He would come up there and kill it because it was invading his territory. So slam your rod so hard you thought it was a big old catfish grabbing it, but then they'd spit it. But I started out using a 14-inch zoom worm, and they wouldn't touch it again. So then I went to the power bait, which I'm a firm believer in. He'd start nibbling it she would, like a sunfish, and pretty soon she'd pick it up and then turn back, and then I would set the hook, and I think it was the second day of the qualifying tournament, and I qualified as a boater. I brought in 23 pounds of largemouth. I just hit 6 spots and caught every one of them that was in that type of structure.
Well, let's talk about the structure and the weeds and stuff. The old saying that the fish are going to be someplace. They're going to be shallow, deep, or somewhere in between. So that's a given fact. But fishing shallow, I mean, weeds, wood, some type of structure is what you want, right?
Yeah, I always look for inside weed line in the spring that's 2 to 3 to 4 feet tall, where it gives them an edge to cruise. They'll stage there before they go up into the slop bays or hard bottom areas to spawn. And, the most dominant technique is throwing a wacky rig. And you can wing a wacky rig weightless. You can put the O-rings on them, and that changes the action some versus putting a hook right through the middle of them or offset off the middle an inch or two to give it a little different action. But what I like to do is I'll take a little tungsten insert and put it on the tail, and then I'll use just a regular straight shank hook and hook it Texas rig. And so what happens is, let's say, if you're bringing it back to the weeds and it hits the weeds, then you just kind of whip your rod tip on a spinning rod and you put another loop of line that lays on the water, and then that bait falls straight back, away from you. So you're bringing the weight up to the weeds and then back down and up to the weeds. And so what you're doing is you're creating the bait to be up off the bottom. So when they're cruising, I've watched them, all of a sudden that they come both ways are coming to grab it. And, many years ago, they invented the banjo minnow, so you could throw it underneath the dock or wherever. It'll just glide away from you. And, I'm surprised there haven't been more sales of that, but that was a good technique. And that gave me the idea of how waiting different baits to fall away from you to keep it in the bass's strike zone versus having a wacky worm right there and, tapping your rod to create it to quiver, and just wait. But so that way you could fish a little faster, cover more area and find the little turns, the inside turn or even up on reeds, where if the bait's leaving their strike zone and they go up, they're not going to chase it. And then all of a sudden it comes back at them. Well, another bass comes in to get curious, and then, you'll get usually the biggest one to bite it.
Well, and that's interesting. You're talking about trying to keep a bait in the strike zone, because I've applied that tactic to muskies and everything else for a long time. And I've always said is that whether it's a crankbait, a topwater bait, a plastic of some type, if you can make it move the most amount of movement and stay with the little forward movement, stay in that zone where they're looking at it for a while, your odds of getting hit are much better than if it's in and out of their strike zone area pretty quick.
That reminds me of a topwater bait. Like Zero Spooks, you can create a lot of action, and it doesn't cover a lot of water, like a whopper popper is pretty much, you're going to cover a lot of water. You're going to get a reaction bait more so than, a hunt and seek with the spook. And you can actually, if you throw it, downwind, you can keep it in one spot going back and forth for quite a few rod jerks.
Yeah, and interesting, we were talking about a worm a minute ago, weighting a worm, tail weighting a worm, and there's just a whole lot of ways you could work a worm. And that's a common, there basically are three different common baits people think about when it comes to bass, I think, largemouth. The plastic worm, a topwater bait of some kind, and literally spinner baits. And there's right and wrong. There's no right or wrong way, I guess, to fish them, but there's other ways to fish them than the common perception on them. When you talked about a worm, I think the common perception is we put a slip sinker in front of it and we fish it that way. There's times when you want to fish it with no weight on it, just a hook, and you can change the weight of the hook itself to a heavier gauge hook. There's times when you weight it, like you said, with a wacky rig. There's times when you weight it tail weight. There's just a whole bunch of ways of working that particular bait, right?
Yeah, shaky head has really gained a lot of force due to the plastic that they have now floats. So with a shaky head, you worm pretty much straight up in the water column, and when it gets to a tough bite, sometimes quivering that down there, they'll swim up and grab it. And then, jigworm. Jigworm is when their pH gets at a specific number, a lot of the fish suspend on the weed lines, and jigworm with a light weight. I like using culprit or, power bait, something with a flag tail is really, really good. And then a lot of times they'll be up on the top of the weeds, and then Producto makes a really good, flat tail worm that's really, really pliable, really soft. It does a lot of action. Z-Man fat Z worm is really pliable, works really, really good, for finessing on top of the weeds when they're suspended right underneath the canopy, and they'll come up and grab it.
When they moved out into that deeper weed edge or that deeper cabbage, anywhere from 8 feet to 20 feet or so, the jigworm is a really overlooked thing. I mean, I remember one time years ago, I was over to Camp Fish, and I was fishing with one of the original in-fisherman guys. I don't remember which one it was right now off the top of my head. I think I do, but anyway, we were fishing, and that was back when there was the big water dog craze. He had live water dogs, and we were on this small lake, and we found largemouth. They were right in that 25 foot area in deep weeds right off the edge of the break. And I was fishing on a mushroom head jig with just a plain culprit worm on it. And after we fished for a few hours, he looked at me, he says, it's surprising. You're catching fish for fish with me. The only difference is I'm catching bigger fish. But, that plastic worm was the trick. I was catching numbers of fish, and it's just using a simple jig worm.
Yeah, I grew up using the Connie Peterson jig worm. It had the round head, and the eye was, 90 degrees right up. And so even if you do get snagged up in the weeds, you just flip your rod a little bit, and it snaps off, and then you see the sunfish go because they think, something's busting up the weeds, and, because they eat it's really good on cabbage, and when they suspend over coontail, it's really good too.
Yeah, when you're talking shallow, we were just talking shallow presentations a little bit ago, but is there a particular type of weed you happen to like? I mean, I like to see if I can find a patch of red cabbage. I mean, I usually find fish in it if they're up shallow.
I like finding flats that has all the weeds.
All the weeds.
Yeah, because you have red top cabbage, and then there's some curly cabbage, and there's the regular super bright green cabbage where it has through the fall turnover, it'll collect sediment on the break. So then you'll have coontail grow, which is a non-rooted plant that grows on sediment. So it creates a strong environment. And, I like to see sand on shore that has clam beds or snails or something, because, sunfish eat snails. I think I might have mentioned that before, and I witnessed it. So it creates a strong ecosystem, so you just got to dissect and figure out what depth zone they're using.
And sometimes just a more rock and pebble along the beach tells you that there's a different type of substructure out farther deep.
Yeah, well, reeds, so you can look on a shoreline, and all carnivorous trees grow on sand, elm and some other ones, that grow on clay. You can find them transition areas that sometimes can make a good migration route. It seems like when the glaciers came through, it seems like, not all the lakes, but most of the time, the west side of a lake has the best deposits for rock ridges and stuff.
Well, one thing I noticed years ago was that if you find, you've seen some pencil reeds or bulrushes, not necessarily cattails. You usually got some harder substrates, some rock and some gravel mixed in there.
Yeah, so if you find those areas, that's where the crappies are going to spawn. The bass can spawn right in them, or really shallow on them. And then, look for those areas. And then, cattails, of course, are another kind of non-rooted plant. A lot of times they're floating within the water column, and it creates bog. Mm-hmm. In the spring. That collects a lot of sun, and some of the biggest bass will be underneath that bog right away in the spring on the back of these pockets. And you just throw a little stick worm up there, and you can have a lot of fun. There's a few lakes that have it around here.
Well, another bait that's a common bait, really common bait, a lot of people just grab spinner baits, casual anglers especially, and there's no wrong way to fish a spinner bait, but there's ways that you could catch more fish on it, right?
Yes, you can cover water. Almost any given day or temperature, wind, it works better and a little bit more wind than, say, on the calm side of a bay is throwing a spinner bait. Spinner baits are kind of overlooked. It seems like chatterbait has taken over the market, so if you want to show them something a little different, spinner baits. I use spinner baits quite a bit.
But I don't just usually very rarely do I use a steady straight in retrieve. I usually pulse the reel handle or the rod a little bit to try to get some vertical in the horizontal drive of that bait, because it seems like when I start doing that, it drops off the edge of a weed or it contacts a weed or something. That's when I get strikes a lot more. Yeah,
especially just jerking your rod a little bit as you're reeling. It pulsates that skirt, and it creates a more injured profile. And then if you want to slow the spinnerbait down, keeping the same larger profile and weight, you can put a plastic trailer on it. And, a lot of times I'll grab a spinnerbait that has that secondary length of skirt in the back that covers my trailer hook. And that's more for speed. Yeah. Because speed does make a difference. And if they're not coming up all the way up, you'll see swirls behind your spinnerbait. That tells you need to slow down and do some little trick moves. It's just like, experiment and have fun.
What do you look at as blades? There are different types of blades on the spinnerbaits. You got the round Colorados, you got tandems, you got singles, you got willow leafs.
Yeah, so every manufacturer makes such a variety. It's get confusing to figure out which one. I always use tandem colors. Seems like dual colors always creates more bites. And then water temp and water clarity indicate what blades. So if it's super clear, I just go with willows, either gold up front or silver on the back.
Usually you run a little deeper with the willows, right?
Well, depends. Sometimes you can burn them right underneath the surface so they create a wake, and they'll come from great distance, but that's just a small window. In general, you want to be close to cover, whether you're pitching it in reeds. In reeds, I like having it like half the depth of the water column. Let's say you're in 2 feet. I like the spinnerbait to be down, 2 feet. Or if I'm 6 feet of water, I like to be down at 3 feet, or just above a weed flat. If I'm going on a inside weed line, I'll have my boat, as shallow as I can get, and I'll fan cast shore, go out a little deeper, and then go right on the inside weed line. And then sometimes, if the wind's coming in, I'll be on the shore and throw it out to the wind, and it seems like you catch more fish that way.
And we're talking that shallow, deep, that inside weed edge. That seems to be a pattern I've seen too on lakes. So if you have a higher density of other predators, like a higher density of walleyes, a higher density of muskies, most of the largemouth will be on that inside weed edge or between there and shoreline, and not you catch the bigger ones out deep. But if the walleye population starts to go down in a lake, then the bass will move out to that deeper weed edge more often, it seems like. I mean, that's just my observation, but
especially after the sunfish get done spawning. Both bass and sunfish are in the same family of fish. And it seems like, the bass will be up there on the inside weed lines near areas that the sunfish are spawning, because there's all these predators that come in and rob the eggs from the sunfish. And then so the bass are opportunists. Sometimes they'll eat a pretty good sunfish, but usually they like them 2 to 3 inches.
I know a lot of fish like to eat bluegills. I mean, I like to eat bluegills. I'm not a fish, but that it seems like it's a favorite species, target species for walleyes too, even as far as the forage food. We talked about spinner baits. That's a common bait. Now, the other third one I mentioned was topwater baits. And topwater, everybody has fun fishing topwaters, but there are a lot of things you can do different on topwater baits too to be more productive, right?
Yeah, for topwaters, it seems like largemouth are on any depth, outside weed lines, on the flat, inside, right next to a dock, is the first hour of daylight is when you can really locate a good school of fish. It seems like that's always the best time. And then you got to have partial sunny, cloudy days, kind of a falling barometer. Then they'll work on flats. I mean, you can find them on flats that you never knew these fish existed, but be prepared to lose a few if you're not using a leader, because I'm not goddamn northern's live it too.
Oh, and you don't need to use a steel leader either. Just a good fluorocarbon or a hard nylon, they call it, is pretty much going to save you a lot of baits.
Yeah, try to get one that floats. So fluorocarbon kind of sinks, and
hard mono. I mean, it's hard to find it, but the old original hard mono Mason hardline, that stuff you could try to chew through it. You can't hardly get through it. It's designed for saltwater where everything's got teeth, but that'll float.
Yeah, so if you're using a popper and you're using a leader, it's going to tilt it down, but sometimes you can get a louder chugging sound out of it. It's not going to, usually your poppers, tail sink, but it's not as important as, preserving your $15 bait. Well,
usually you can get away with fluorocarbon too. You just don't, instead of putting 15 feet of fluorocarbon tied to your braid, you put a foot of it, and that gives you that little bite protection window there. And there's not enough weight there in the line to drag your bait down so much.
Yeah, well, if it's not windy, if the water's not super clear, I'll throw braid right to my topwater because that floats. And boy, you have to use a little bit lighter action rod, like a medium light, versus, some topwaters you can use a medium heavy.
Yeah, as far as missing fish with a topwater, okay, you get blows up. What do you do? Do you use a follow-up bait behind them, or do you try a different type of presentation when it comes to that? What?
Well, most of the time, people set visually versus letting the fish turn, with the bait in their mouth. And that's the problem when braid first came out. They were using, a mono design rod and reel combo. And then with no line stretch, see, when the largemouth comes and get it, he'll suck like a quart of water around the bait and everything into his mouth. And he'll suck it and then turn. And a lot of times with the braid, when he goes to turn, you're pulling the bait out of his mouth. And so when they do bite with braid, you want to put your rod down and then let them tighten it up and then set, and you'll increase your hookup ratio considerable, especially frog fishing, because they got all that weed and everything in their mouth too that they disperse back through their gills. Once they get the bait, they'll reposition the bait in their mouth to regrip it, and then they'll blow all the weed growth out of it by blowing more water into their mouth through their gills, and then they'll hold on to it tighter. So when they're frog fishing, you don't necessarily have to set the hook right away. I mean, they're not letting go.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we're talking about different topwater presentations too, but we can go back to that same thing with the keeping the bait in the strike window too. You mentioned the spook type bait. That you work that bait. One of the old fishermen from down in Missouri taught me that. He says you want to see that the tail of the bait stay in a straight line and just the bait flopping side to side, throwing a little bit of water when you do it. He said you're going to miss less fish doing that than if it's gliding wide off to the side.
Yeah, prime example. Hadn't made the jitterbug. Man, that caught a lot of fish when I was younger.
Oh, me too.
And right now, as a tournament angler, I don't have any in my boat, and I'm thinking, kind of, am I missing the boat here or something? Because they're good action little bait.
It is. It makes a lot of disturbance and doesn't move very fast, and it stays in that strike window. There's so many things that you can try out there. I mean, one of the pros from Minnesota one time was somebody asked him, he says, you ever get skunked over there out fishing? And he sat there and scratched his gray beard for a little bit and said, no, I've never been skunked. He says, however, I do run out of time on occasion. There's just more things to try than you got time to try. So you have to kind of analyze what you've got to start with and narrow that window down. What am I going to do that particular day, rather than try to figure you're going to cover everything?
Yeah, one good point is, as far as largemouth, especially on a weed line, boy, you do not want to disrupt the weeds very much. You try to use the lightest weight possible and snake it through the weeds. And because if you start folding over the weeds, it turns them off for like a half hour or 45 minutes.
Or if you're tearing up the weeds, yeah.
Yeah, there are exceptions when they're suspended on a weed line and you're cranking, and you'll disrupt a lot of the weeds. And, they won't bite right then, but if you come back through, it seems like all the minnows and everything try to, gather up the little insect life that you displaced off the weeds, but that's usually not until August.
Yeah, well, you just mentioned crankbaits. When do you go? We mentioned the three that are the common ones, but crankbaits are right there too. So when do you look at using the crankbaits for the largemouth?
Boy, you could use them anytime, but up in this environment that we live in with all these weeds, I don't have a lot of patience to crawl them around, but so some techniques is, post spawn, if you can find, current areas or channel areas like a Minnetonka, this was a really good pattern. You use the large wigglewort. It's got a big bill, really wide wobble, but you don't fish it like a normal crankbait. What you're doing is you're crawling it through the system. And it hits the weeds, and then it floats back up. It's a fast floater up. And then you just crawl along it, and the females just love it. But try to duplicate it around here. I've had days where it's been really good. I was fishing a tournament and I was trying to find a school of largemouth that I found with underwater cameras. And, back before, I had any type of graph or anything, I was just using flashers. And I went on the outside weed line because they were in a saddle up on top, but there was just a 1 foot drop and transition into a cabbage patch. So I went around the corner on this little saddle and went to the deep edge, and boy, I just landed a bunch of 8-9 pound northerns, so I could never figure out what the largemouth were, that particular day. But, I had that crankbait in my hand, because if they went on that edge of the weed line, I could get them, but, the northerns were there.
Yeah, well, you mentioned northerns, and that's one thing we've got an abundance of all across northern Wisconsin here now. Just about every lake's got them in there. So if you're largemouth fishing, so if you got some of the baits that cost you $8, $9, $10, I mean, I mentioned earlier, a little piece of 15, even 20 pound fluorocarbon right in front of your bait's going to stop a lot of them baits from disappearing in the mouth of a toothy critter too.
Yeah, well, largemouths prefer crawdads in their diet. I don't know how many crawdads I've had to clean out of my live wells through the years. So regardless of where you're at, if you can find the harder bottom spots in an area, or if you could find a rock ridge that meets a weed line, towards the end of June, July, well, I'd say July, August, September, throwing a football jig on them rocks can be really, really good. And then sometimes you want to hold your boat on top of the weeds and throw it at a 45 off the rock ridge and, bring it up. And as soon as your rod starts hitting rocks, turn your rod so you're parallel on the edge of that rock ridge right to the weeds, and it's game on. So angle of casting is really important too, to really dissect a piece of structure.
Well, yeah, you want to be really good on casting too, because I've seen where I can remember one instance where I was guiding in people in the boat. I would catch a largemouth about every other cast, but I had to literally put my bait, almost drag it off the shoreline. It was that close. They were in tight, and they couldn't duplicate those casts. So getting good enough casting, you can hit what you want to aim at, because it goes back to putting it in front of that fish in that strike window. You got to be able to get real accurate sometimes.
You'd be surprised of how many fish can be stacked up in a little yard area. Oh. My wife Char and I were fishing a league tournament, and we were on La Coudray, and I just couldn't figure out them largemouth. It was one of my first years here, or smallmouth, so I went largemouth fishing, and we were on an inside rock ledge, inside weed line where it made a little bend, and so all we did is cast in the same spot. We ended up like 18 pounds in like 15, 20 minutes. It was like every cast.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing I've mentioned before, and I've said it lots of times, is that if you're fishing a spinnerbait or a topwater or whatever, and you get in an area, patch of weeds or something, you catch one largemouth in there, don't assume there's only one in there, because there's never only one out there. There seems like there's always more than one bass when it's in one area. Go back into that area with another presentation, whether it's a jig or a plastic worm, something, slow down, and you'll probably find out you're going to catch another 2 or 3 or 4 bass out of there, even more.
Yeah, exactly. And largemouth are a little different than smallmouth. Smallmouth sometimes can be year class driven on creating a school, especially the main lakers. But on largemouth, you can have everything in that school. If there's a lot of bass in certain areas, certain patterns will be the smaller fish. But if you are going to fish the edges of those schools and fish slower, you'll catch the biggest one that kind of babysits that school, because they're opportunists. They let the school push the bait to them.
Yeah.
So their position in certain, it's really hard to explain, because every scenario of the weed development within a certain structure is different. But usually through years of experience, it's like, okay, now I got to cast right here and catch a nice one.
Well, I'm saying I've got my boats about ready to go for this year. I got a small boat to work on yet, but we're only, as we're recording this, we're only a week away or so for the fishing season, and a little over a week, and we'll be out on the water. And there's guys out there right now catching bass and doing okay on smallmouth, especially. I've talked to a few of them.
Yeah, there's been so much tournament talk on Amped Outdoors. Finally, I just had to buy some. Boy, the clarity you get on live scope and the extra power you have for your towing motors, and they have them heated now, so when it's 28 degrees, I can still charge them. I have the app so I can regulate them. And then they have great batteries for RV. I mean, RV's taken over up here too.
Well, lithium is the way to go anymore. It's just, yes, it's an expense to look at to start with, but the batteries are carrying, like from the Amp, they're carrying a 10-year warranty, and they'll outlast, 2 or 3 or 4 sets of regular batteries, which come up to about the same price when you're dealing with it.
Yeah, well, AGM 31 Series Ultima is like $400 some bucks. Well, yeah, and that's a 3-year warranty, so why not get a 10? Yeah,
there's so much out there, and now with the boats we've got with the technology, I mean, a lot of people are running forward-facing sonar. You've got side imaging, down imaging. There's, the worst thing that could happen on there is when your lead acid battery drops down to, below 11 volts, and everything starts to suffer. Adding above 12 volts doesn't help you as far as the picture, but staying at 12 volts and not dropping below that is going to make a big difference. Well, Ken, a lot of interesting stuff here. We're just about done for this podcast, but we're going to come back with another one here. We got a bunch of different things to talk about, and hopefully everybody out there enjoys some of the stuff that we're talking about, and they can get out and catch a few more fish because of it.
Yeah, well, we missed one of the funnest topwater fishing there is. That's frog fishing. So frog fishing it can happen any day, any given time. You just have to try it in the weeds. So one plant to look out for is duckweed. Duckweed comes in various forms. I can't remember how many different strains there are, but it creates more oxygen per surface area than any other plant in our ecosystem. Proven scientific data. And so what happens is once the duckweed gets developed, it kills all the weeds underneath the duckweed. So then it creates, with the decaying weed, you have all the insect life that goes in there, and, the sunfish and the minnows, especially the smaller minnows, they go in there to eat that insect life. It would be not any different than the crappies going out in the deep water basin eating that insect life. Well, the largemouth sit in there. It's usually 2 to 3 degrees cooler underneath there. and it's creating a lot of oxygen. They can sit in there undisturbed by predators, but when a frog comes by, they're going to grab it.
Well, that's one of the most fun fishing there is that topwater fishing frogs. And, there's a wide range of different types of frog stuff out there. It seems like there's no end to that.
Back in the day when I first, braid development, it's like I get a wind gust or try to whip it out too far to get to the bank, and I'd end up getting these professional overruns, if you want to put it politely. And I'd have to put a scissors to the spool until I started using fins, Infinity Black. You can get the worst backlash that you're thinking. You just take your hand and undo her and go, and you're ready to go in just a couple seconds, go for the next cast. So yeah. I do like the fins Infinity for frog fishing.
A lot of great products out there too, Ken. Let's wrap up this podcast where we've talked a bunch of different stuff, and I don't know what the topic is going to be on the next one coming out, but if you like what we're doing here, please subscribe to the channel. And, we're going to keep doing the bass thing as many as we can. We'll get busy during the summertime. I know I get busy guiding. Ken gets busy with tournaments and a bunch of stuff. So we're going to try to put out as many as we can and keep you informed out there. Anyway, I want to thank everybody, and thanks, Ken, for coming in here.
All right. Thanks, John. And hopefully we'll get into colors and equipment used for specific techniques.
You bet. Well, thanks a lot. Well, folks, that about wraps up this edition of the Northland Bassin Podcast. If you'd like more information on the Hayward, Wisconsin area, check out the Wisconsin Northland Outdoors Radio Show on our other podcast channel, wnoradio.podbean.com, or for even more information on the web at haywardlakes.com or wnoradio.com. Thanks for listening, and watch for our next Northland Bassin podcast. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe to the channel.